Hey, Larken Rose here, and in the last few weeks I've had several different people ask me about the same thing, and I thought I'd do a video about it. Now, the title, Counseling for Anarchists, might seem sort of flippant, but that's kind of what this is going to be. A number of people asked me, and a bunch of people have asked me before, but recently enough people asked me that I thought, yeah, I should do a video about it. There's sort of two sides to the question. One is, how do you deal with the people you know believing in the basically violent subjugation of mankind? If you became a voluntarist but you're still surrounded by statists who are still voting and advocating violent government aggression for one thing or another, and these are the people in your life, these are the people you know and you care about and you have to deal with, how do you live surrounded by people who advocate the subjugation of mankind and advocate violent aggression against everybody they know and everybody they don't know? Like, how are you supposed to just pretend that isn't the case when it's somebody close to you? Like if it's a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a spouse or something, or a parent or whatever, when it's somebody in your life and important to you and they still believe that stuff, how do you deal with that? How do you not just get stressed out and frustrated? And so that the personal side is one part of the question, and then the more general sort of societal situation is the other side of the question that I get from people, which is basically, if you're living in a society that believes in this authoritarian garbage, and day in and day out, not only you're surrounded by people in this message everywhere, but you have to comport your actions to fit within the rules dictated by arbitrary authority. Like, you can decide to drive without a driver's license, but bad things might happen to you. You can decide to do, like, not have a sticker on your car, not have a license plate, but bad things may very well happen to you. So the whole balance between, well, how much should we compromise, or how much should we just fight everyone and everything and get stressed out and burn out and go insane, or, die in a hail of gunfire, or just run off in the woods and become a hermit? So, and it's a serious question, and it's trying to live your life and be at peace when almost everybody around you is advocating things that completely rule out any possibility of moral, peaceful coexistence. That's difficult. Like, I've done it for more than a quarter of a century. I understand. And I'm not trying to belittle that, because that's really serious. And, like, imagine in comparison, if I'll use the example of Frederick Douglass. If you were raised as a slave, not only does the owner treat you as a slave, but all of your fellow slaves treat you as if you and all of them are the owner's rightful property. Because in a lot of cases, that was the situation, as hard as that may be for us to imagine. And Frederick Douglass describes that, of being a slave and the slow process of realizing that this isn't okay, this isn't just, this isn't legitimate for somebody else to own me. And that was a process. And the only reason that was a process is because, from the time he was born, he was surrounded by people who believed that slavery as an institution was somehow valid, even if they didn't like it. Sort of like people can say, well, I don't really like what government's doing, but democracy and constitutional republics, and they're awesome. So they can complain about the symptoms, they complain about the outcome, but they still advocate the very problem that's causing it. So imagine if you were raised as a slave and you're starting to figure out, this isn't okay. I'm not the rightful property of somebody else. I own myself, and none of this should be happening to me. And then imagine being surrounded by a whole bunch of slaves who think you're wrong and think you're crazy and actually get mad at you when you tell them you're not his rightful property either. You should own yourselves. We should be free. And having them get mad at you. And that happened. Like, that was a real thing, even with something as heinously obnoxious as slavery, which, now we can all look back and say, well, that's, obviously horrible. Is there anybody pro-slavery left? But the fact that we all recognize it now doesn't mean they recognized it at the time. So imagine how frustrating that would be. Incidentally, this sort of shows up in the Jones Plantation, because the closest thing to a hero, the good guy, Samuel, is figuring out this isn't okay and this is horribly wrong. And he gets resistance not from his victimizers. Well, he gets resistance from them too. But he gets resistance from his fellow victims, because they don't think the way he does and they don't see things the way he does. So, yeah, in the modern version, we're not being literally whipped and forced to labor for somebody else. Well, we're part-time forced to labor for somebody else. That's what an income tax is. By the way, Frederick Douglass figured that out too, and ended up being more offended by the idea of an income tax where the master let him go work and let him keep a little bit of he produced, and he figured out this is literally worse than slavery. So when a former slave says that an income tax is literally worse than slavery, that's kind of impressive. But anyway, back to the mentality and the psychology involved. Trying to maintain your own mental well-being when you're surrounded by people who can't see the things you see. Can't yet see the things you see. I should point that out because that's an important element. It's really dang frustrating. Now, most of the people I know, myself included, who are now voluntarists weren't. They grew up as statists. So thinking back to the former statist you, if there was one, try to have as much sympathy as you can for the you that believed stupid garbage, because there was a me that believed stupid statist garbage. And that me wasn't trying to be evil, and that me wasn't stupid, despite believing stupid stuff, because I was indoctrinated into it and hadn't yet aimed my brain at questioning it. That's just sort of a thing I took for granted, which almost everybody does. Everybody raised in a statist authoritarian society takes it for granted that, of course there's going to be a government, of course there would be chaos or something without it. I don't know. I can't even imagine what it would be without it. And so a few suggestions I'll give here about how do you maintain anything like mental stability and not going completely bonkers when these things have become so obvious to you, like the concept of self-ownership. Why does that need to be explained to anybody? Like you having to go to somebody and tell them nobody has the right to rule you, and them arguing, yes they do. It's like, oh, wow, what a weird position to be in, where you're not arguing with the victimizers, you're arguing with the victims, and they're arguing in favor of their own victimization and in favor of your victimization, which makes it way worse. So if you're surrounded by, friends and family and coworkers who all believe that you should be forcibly extorted and controlled by a ruling class, that's a hard thing to deal with. Now, the closest thing I can point to as an exercise that I went through, I do not suggest that you did this, was being in prison for a year. For those who don't know, they stuck me in prison for a year for not sending pieces of paper to the IRS. Not even green pieces of paper, just the tax returns. And that's a whole other story. It wasn't a tax protest. It wasn't about anything philosophical. It's about the fact they lie about their laws. But maybe I'll put the link below to the free PDF of the thing that's all about that. But that's completely aside from this. So in prison, it's a constant restrictions and injustice in all directions, where you have no privacy and you're allowed to own almost nothing. Like a few trivial little things. You're not allowed to trade with anybody. You're not allowed to gift anybody anything. Now, of course, inmates find ways to do all those things anyway, and good for them for doing so. But one of the weirdest things that struck me while in prison, And I was in minimum security. I mean, I was only in the hole in solitary for, I think, a couple days on the way in while they processed paperwork, which was especially stupid in my case because it was a self-surrender. In other words, I show up on a certain day and then go to the no security camp because they knew I wasn't a flight risk. So I came in on my own power and surrendered on this certain day, and they put me in solitary while they processed the paperwork. Like, why didn't you just process the paperwork before I showed up? Anyway, whatever. They're stupid. But so I end up in minimum security prison camp in Waymart, Pennsylvania, downhill from the real high security. I don't even know what level security that was. But I was down in the minimum security camp. But one of the weirdest things that struck me being there, and that's relevant to the point here, is how much it's just the same as life. It's just a worse example of government having its tentacles and everything. Like, well, I want to do this. Well, you need permission. You have to fill out a form and you need to do this. Make sure that, well, I want to do this. Well, you can't because there's a rule against that for this stupid reason that has nothing to do with you. And so dealing with stupid bureaucracies, like I wanted to get a piano donated to the place. So they literally have a piano because they had a few of the crappiest guitars imaginable and they have exercise stuff. And I said, well, there's no keyboard or piano here. What if I can get one donated here? You don't have to pay anything and it won't be mine. It will be donated. Anybody can use it. And I had basically arranged for some outside group to do that by way of somebody on the outside helping find that. And they said, well, no, you can't do that because it can't look like it came from you. Like if some random organization had donated a piano, that would be okay. And I said, well, it is some random organization. I'm not giving you my piano. But somebody out there found an organization willing to donate a piano. I'm just here to ask if you'd accept it. Well, no, we can't because you're not giving me preferential treatment. You're a bunch of parasitic buttheads anyway. And I use that just as an example of the stupid rules that we all have to deal with in normal life anyway, outside of prison. Well, outside of that side of prison, inside the bigger prison. So if you're a voluntarist and it's well, I want to build a deck on my house. Well, you have to get approval and file all these papers and pay a fee for and go to a bunch of parasitic bureaucrats to ask permission to do something on your own property because it isn't really your property because they rob you and control it and do the property tax thing of forcing you to continually pay for your property so you can keep it or they steal it. Okay, so in this world, you don't own anything either. And they can tax you, and they can inheritance tax and income tax and sales tax and all sorts of things. But it was funny because I noticed that minimum security federal prison is significantly more annoying and restrictive. But in essence, it's not that different from our daily lives out in the bigger prison known as the United States or whatever other country you happen to be in, because it's true all over the place. Because it's still, well, you can't do this without permission, you can't do that without permission. If you do this, you're going to be punished. And you have to do this, and you're not allowed to do that. And, in there, it's you can't trade at all. Out here, it's, well, you can't trade until you get a license, and then you fill out these forms, and you have a certain thing, and the zoning has to match the thing, and you have to do a thing to this, and then collect sales tax, and then do, all the stupid things you can imagine. So the reason I bring that up is the experience of trying to adapt to being at peace while in prison was a prolonged ordeal for me, especially given that I was there for something I didn't do. I didn't file the returns, and I wasn't required to. So what I did wasn't illegal. They pretended it was and had to make an example of me. And I was trying to get them to make an example of me. You can read my whole story. I wasn't cheating and hiding stuff over here. I was in their face the whole time, being very loud about it because I wanted to be the guinea pig they went after if they were going to go after somebody. That's a whole other story. You can go look it up. But I only bring that up because the ordeal of, okay, for the next 15 months, I have to live in this box with a bunch of people I don't know. Some of whom were pretty cool, a bunch of whom, whatever, under the control of a bunch of bureaucratic imbeciles. And I do mean imbeciles. The people who run the minimum security camps are just morons. And, I mean, same thing if you go to the DMV or you go to some other government agency or the IRS for that matter. It's run mostly by idiots who can't do anything productive enough that somebody will voluntarily pay them to do more. So you're constantly subjected to the limitations put around you by these parasitic idiots that you're forced to deal with. You already know this if you live in the US or almost anywhere else. So how are you supposed to be at peace being in that setting, whether it's in prison or in the bigger prison? And that's, a lot of people ask me, and I can totally sympathize having been in both prisons. And there's part of it, it's hard to describe. I refer to it as going into spectator mode. It's like if you got captured by cannibals or something, you're off in some random jungle and you got captured by cannibals. They don't speak your language. You can't reason with them. They have you in a cage. And you don't have to take it personally and have it hurt your feelings. You still have to deal with it. You might want to try to escape before they eat you. So they're just sort of, it's like a rabid dog or something. They're a risk to you and you have to deal with them accordingly. Like I view all cops as rabid dogs. Yeah, once upon a time they were people, but something really twisted and weird infected their brain and now they behave like violent, dangerous monsters. That's rabies and it's also being a law enforcer. And so I literally view them that way, and it makes it easier. Because now it's not a person whose consideration I need to win over. I don't have to care what they think. It doesn't hurt my feelings that they don't do that they behave the way they do, because I expect them to. And I'm just sort of this observer of, well, there's somebody with their brain screwed up in a way that makes them dangerous to other people. Whether it's dementia or being a cop, because it's the same result, except the cop is more dangerous. And being able to be detached makes it so you don't have to take it personally. It's the same thing with just arguing with random people online who are statists. It's natural and human to sort of become psychologically invested in this is an important truth. This is really important to the future of humanity. And so I really need these other people to understand this and see this thing that's so important and, that you care about so much, and they don't want to listen. And it's very easy to take it personally and become invested in those other people need to understand this. Instead of think of it as, well, I can be up here and try to say what I want or ask what I want and see if I can get them to think about it. But at the end of the day, it's not up to me what they believe or what they think about or whether they think about anything. I can't make them do that. But the process of that sort of semi-detachment, because it's not like, in that case, it's not like you don't care about them. It's like, well, you can just go burn in hell. I don't care. But there's a certain level of not being invested in what they think. Now, the closer the person is to you, the harder that gets to do and the more of a balancing act it is. Because, I'll use the example of a spouse because that's theoretically about as close as you can get. What do you do if you figured out all this stuff and now you're a voluntarist and your spouse is a devout statist and you're stuck in that situation? You can't just not care about them and not care what they think. Now, ultimately, I think in the long run, if somebody advocates the enslavement of mankind and you don't, that has to change. And it may have to change by you leaving them and running away. Or it may be able to change by you finding a way to talk to them to actually have them reconsider stuff and think about stuff. But even in the short term, even if you're thinking, well, this person, there's a family member or a spouse or whatever, or like, if in the short term you can remind yourself what you used to be, assuming you used to be a statist, and think, well, this is just the other me. I don't have to disown the old me Because eventually the old me will become the new me and understand this stuff. And one of the most important parts of getting along with people is to recognize that first of all, the stupid status crap they believe was not their idea. They did not come up with it. They may be devout, true believers in it, but it was still indoctrinated into it. And they didn't choose it for themselves. They were tricked into believing it. So if you can remember that the real them is a nice person and intelligent to whatever level, but misguided, it makes it a lot easier than viewing them as an advocate of widespread immoral aggression, even though they literally are. But they're not advocating that because they sat down one day and said, all right, I want to violently control all my neighbors. Yeehaw. They're doing it because even though they probably think as voluntarists in their day-to-day lives, they were taught that when it's done by politics, violent aggression and domination and subjugation of humanity is not only good and righteous, but completely necessary. It would be chaos and anarchy otherwise. So they were tricked into believing something. Now, another analogy I could use is imagine, and I've used this analogy before. Imagine you meet some tribe, in some jungle in the middle of nowhere. You know almost nothing about them. For some reason, you speak the same language. Okay, this hypothetical is ridiculous. But imagine you meet this tribe, and they're so nice to each other, and they're kind, and they're getting along, and they seem to be living at one with nature, and it's this glorious thing. And then one day they seem a little bit bummed out, and you're like, what's the problem? What's going on? Well, we're coming up on the time where we have to make a sacrifice to the volcano god to give us good crops next year. Like, what? What are you talking about? Well, if we don't throw a virgin into the volcano, the gods will get mad at us and ruin our crops. So you're there among these nice people, and once a year they commit murder based on their completely misguided understanding of reality. Well, that's just living anywhere in the world. It's not necessarily murder. But when you're surrounded by statists, they can be caring, kind, generous, intelligent people, but they've been tricked into this thing that makes them, oh yeah, well in that case, we're going to advocate violent aggression, including against you, maybe. And admittedly, it's really hard to not take that personally. Like if you're somebody who happens to smoke pot in a place where it's illegal, and you think that some of your friends and family who you get along with pretty well, if they knew, they might call the authorities on you, like that's really bad. And to try to keep in your brain the fact that they actually mean well, and they think they're doing the right thing, and they're trying to be good people, not doing a great job of it, but they're trying to be good people, and within the BS that they were indoctrinated into, they think the right thing is to turn you in for having a plant that the politicians don't approve of. And so that would be a pretty extreme example of one of the more difficult things to try to be at peace with is your brain is messed up. Like you may be generally a nice, intelligent person, but your brain is messed up, which makes you a threat to everybody's freedom and specifically a threat to me. So how am I supposed to be at peace with that? How am I supposed to be okay with the fact that you are that? And that's problematic. I'm not pretending it's easy, but it makes it a lot easier if you understand what's going on inside their head. And if you can see, and this is something we teach in Candles in the Dark, if you can in your mind keep in mind the difference between the part of them that's really them, the things that they chose, and then the authoritarian statist crap they were taught, which doesn't at all match. That never matches in anybody. And if you can see through, well, here's okay, you were taught to throw somebody into a volcano once a year. That's really bad. That's really horrible. That's dreadful. But you don't recognize it as dreadful because of your weird belief system, even if most of the time you're perfectly nice and caring and generous, but you were taught this loony stuff that makes you literally a danger to other people in this certain way at this certain time. And that's true of everybody who votes. Like in their day-to-day lives, you may get along with them just fine. And then you're like, can I talk to you about the fact that you vote for somebody to rob me? And I have a particular case of that, the vast majority of people I know, well, now I know a whole bunch of volunteers, but in my normal life, the people I knew in person before, the vast majority of them voted for people to be in power that they knew would rob me and cage me if I didn't pay up, and then I got robbed and caged because I didn't file tax returns. So all those people I know voted to have exactly that happen to me, including some of the nicest, most generous people, and they're like really smart in a bunch of other ways. So like, it's a little bit weird trying to be at peace and happy and friendly among people who literally contributed, however indirectly, to me being caged for a year and robbed into poverty and in debt. And I'm still not out of debt from that, from over a decade ago. So that's kind of weird. It's kind of weird trying to be friendly and nice to these people and not take it personally, the fact that they advocated that. And they continue to advocate that people be robbed and dominated by a ruling class. Every Republican does that. Every Democrat does that. Every voter does that. I don't care where you are in the political spectrum. So if you're not on the political spectrum and you're mostly surrounded by these people, it's sort of one of the most important things to still being at peace is to not be frantic and desperate to change their minds. Yes, I know how cool it would be for them to stop being advocates of authoritarian domination. Yeah, I fully understand. But to try to see the real them, try to see the good in them even when they're advocating evil, which I know is difficult, especially when you're personally on the receiving end of the evil. And that makes it harder and harder. But being surrounded not just by the people around you, but the whole culture, I suggest you view it, this doesn't sound like it would help, but from past experience, I think it might. I would suggest you view it as being in prison. The really big prison. It's called a country. And realize that, yes, you are restricted and acting like a free human being. There's a bunch of things you can pretend to be free about, and there's some things that if you act like a free human being, thugs of the state will probably come after you and do nasty things to you. And you have to decide for yourself at what level you're willing to resist. Like, there's a bunch of things I go along with to avoid having a freaking shootout. Like, I have a driver's license. I don't think I'm morally obligated to. I don't think anybody has the moral right to, like, kidnap me for going somewhere without having their politicians' written permission. But I do that. I go along with the rules of the prison in that example, so that I don't get beat up or shot or thrown in a cage or whatever. And if you just come to grips with the fact that you're in a really big prison, but a pretty permissive prison, like compared to actual prison, you can do pretty much in this bigger prison. But if you just come to grips with the fact that, well, that's the state of reality right now, and most of the people around me don't yet understand that there's anything wrong with that, and trying to be at peace with the fact that they're unwitting accomplices of evil, not because they're malicious or idiots, but because they're indoctrinated. While being good people, they have these really bad ideas that have been drilled into their heads. And so did you. Well, most of you anyway, and so did I. I used to be a statist. And I used to believe that stuff, and I used to advocate that stuff. I used to advocate authoritarian aggression for the things that I thought were important, a big military and a police and blah, 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 you know. It's pretty embarrassing looking back on it now. But there's sort of it's a skill, it's an acquired skill being able to be at peace in a world that has lots of things wrong with it and lots of things that just shouldn't be. And to me, that isn't just in the field of like voluntarism versus statism. That's sort of in everything. And it took me years just to get to where I am, which is by no means like fixed and, ultimate Zen master or anything. But to be at peace, it's this weird dichotomy. I'll explain this and I'll end with this, even though I can't even really explain how I got there. But this weird dichotomy of, I don't want to be at peace with the world being screwed up to a degree that I'm not trying to unscrew it up. And I still spend a lot of time and effort doing what I can to try to unscrew up the world. But at the same time, it's gonna drive you bonkers and stress you out and like at some point literally make you insane if you can't sort of be at peace with the fact that, well, that's reality right now. That's the reality that you're in. And getting really mad and anxious about it isn't what changes it. And that weird balancing act dichotomy that I can't even exactly describe how I got there. And it took years and years because, yeah, I would take everything personally. Every status, stupidity, all of that I would take personally because I recognize that is, causing real harm to a huge amount of people. It's causing horrendous injustice and torture and murder and extortion and like real world, really nasty things. And on the one hand, I don't want to be at peace with that to the point I'm just like, whatever. As long as it's not me suffering, I don't give a crap. And I'm never going to be at peace with that in that way. But to be at peace, that saying, I'm going to butcher it. It's like, Lord, give me the strength to change the things I can and the humility or whatever to accept the things I can't change and the wisdom to know the difference. And I think that saying, whether you want the religious version or not, is really important. And it's really profound and really important to your own mental well-being to realize you can't fix the whole world tomorrow. Maybe you can't fix the whole world ever. Maybe you can do a little tiny bit to help nudge it in the right direction. And in the meantime, there's going to be lots of horrible things going on. And being at peace with that, while also strongly pushing against it as hard as you can, is a very weird balancing act. And it's hard to even describe. But I'll try to describe how I see things now, even though I don't exactly know how I got there. And I wish all of you could just skip to that and be there, where you can see somebody advocating status lunacy and whatever form that may take, whether it's military warmongering or the war on drugs or the IRS or, there's plenty of examples of stupid and unjust status crap going on. See somebody who advocates that and realize that person right now is a cheerleader for evil. It's probably not from their own malice. It's probably because they were indoctrinated into believing that. And even though on a practical level, they are my enemy because they're advocating the exact opposite of what I'm advocating, which is peaceful coexistence, try to see inside them the potential ally. And the thing is, our seminar, Candles in the Dark, that we did, and then recently we added the thing called Making Anarchy Mainstream. Candles in the Dark is all about talking to the ally inside the person that's already inside the person you're talking to, inside the status. Because Candles in the Dark is mostly about one-on-one conversations with people who are statists. And it's about finding their inner voluntarist underneath the layers of authoritarian garbage and helping them out of it. So the main focus there is how can you most effectively help other people to realize that statism doesn't match what they believe and is insane and destructive and immoral and all that fun stuff. But a convenient side effect of using those methods is it's way better for your mental health and ability to be at peace to recognize these other people as just misguided and duped and still well-intentioned and still good people. Now, that's sort of a debatable thing because, well, if you were duped into cheering for outright evil, do you count as a good person anymore? So, whatever. Maybe not. People can argue about what counts as a good person, but they're not trying to be evil. They're well-intentioned. They're hugely misguided. And they're cheering for things that are horrible and destructive because they were tricked into that by the control freaks' games and schemes. But to sort of recognize that you're... Okay, this is going to sound a little bit degrading and elitist, and I just don't care because it's factually true. Look at the rest of the world as a bunch of clueless children that haven't yet woken up to being grown-ups. And sometimes they're bratty and sometimes they're stupid and they do stupid, nasty things, but they're just children. Because statists really are just children. They were trained to not think like grown-ups. I've done other videos about this, so I'm not going to get into it all that much. But if you view other people as misguided but well-intentioned, now, that isn't everybody. There are some who obviously are not well-intentioned, who are generally psychopathic. Pretty much everybody who runs for office, not quite everybody, but almost, and anybody who achieves high office, you can't get there unless you're a self-absorbed megalomaniac without a soul. But as far as the normal people around you, viewing them as merely misguided, and it can still be really frustrating to watch them loudly cheering for their own enslavement. But if you can try to understand how they were deceived and try to understand how they see the world, I don't mean to agree with it because they're totally wrong. I mean to understand, how is this good person cheering for this authoritarian idiot who's like promising to do nasty things? And that's Democrats and Republicans. And it isn't just in the U.S. Like, you look historically at the cheering throngs adoring Mao and Stalin and Lenin and Hitler and Pol Pot and, you know, pretty much every single famous tyrant you can think of, the people cheered for. So do that as a mental exercise. All right, you can pick one, Nazi Germany or Red China. You're in the crowd surrounded by these people all excited about what they're hearing from this power-happy psycho who isn't acting and talking like a power-happy psycho, because you don't win anybody over that way. He's talking about how he's going to help the people and free the people and serve the people and how great our country is and how his plan will make everything yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. Like every political campaign ever. Give me power and I'll make all these wonderful things happen. And imagine being around those people and try to relate to them. You can't relate to their indoctrination if you're a voluntarist, but relate to their good intentions and focus on that. And more than anything else, realize that that means there is hope. And this was a huge thing for me to realize and was so much more freeing and relieving. There is hope because 99% of statists, they're not statists from being malicious and evil and nasty. They're statists because their goodness was exploited to trick them into cheering for authoritarianism. And that's true on all sides. The goodness of the political left of, don't you care about the poor and you want people taken care of and you want people to have housing and yeah, I want all that stuff, from their goodness and their care of their fellow man. And then the politicians say, well, then give us power and let us rob you and all your neighbors. Okay, because of my goodness and my generosity. Now, you can argue that at some point they can't really plead ignorance anymore when the violence becomes obvious, and I agree, and that's a different debate to have. But the more you can recognize the good intentions, however misguided and however stupid their actual actions are, or downright evil, if you could recognize their good intentions, and it's the same thing on the right. The conservatives, we want, innocent people protected. We want the bad guys defeated, so on and so forth. So we're going to have a big authoritarian, police force. Okay, if you wanted the innocent protected, that's not the way to do it. But if you can recognize their good intentions and talk to them like misguided children, because statists are misguided children. And the trouble is, they're big and they have guns. So they're dangerous, misguided children. But if you can bring yourself to recognize that, not just of strangers out there, but of the people close to you care about. Family members and co-workers and spouses, one of the most uncomfortable things that I hear about often is when one member of a couple becomes a voluntarist and they're like, oh, but my husband, he's not on board yet. Yeah, that's a sucky position to be in. And it's really difficult. And in some cases, I would say, run away. But first, just like with everybody else, recognize that this person probably means well. I hope you didn't marry somebody who's genuinely a malicious imbecile. assuming you didn't, they probably mean well, and they believe that they're the good guy. And this is an important thing to remember, and it's something that may very well take an effort on your part. Again, Candles in the Dark gets into this way more, and I think that will not only help with your communication skills, but with your own mental well-being, to put you in a state of mind where you recognize them for what they are. And they're not genuinely, individually malicious. They're people trying to be good people who believe stupid stuff. But that, to see through that to what somebody is, and that they're just misguided children, even though they're dangerous, misguided children, like I said, and then to have to deal with that is still inconvenient. Like, you're still going to have things forced on you, you're still going to be limited, like, nasty things are still going to happen. But even in the extreme example of, okay, you got pulled over and there's this delusional jackass with a badge and a uniform, and he may do his swagger and he may be on his little power trip, because if you give somebody power, they usually go on a power trip and become an even bigger butthead than they were before. But within the whole range of how much of a butthead he is, a lot of cops joined up trying to be the good guy. And if in that case where somebody literally just threatened you with violence by turning on the red and blue lights and is coming up to try to find an excuse to steal some of your money to give it to his political masters, because that's what a ticket is, even in that case, to try to recognize, it doesn't mean you're going to get out of the ticket. You may still get robbed. But even in that case, to try to get into his head, not because he's right, but just to understand, like, know your enemy. And I'll end with this. When you're a voluntarist looking out at a world of statists, including the people close to you, it's really important to know your enemy. And one of the main reasons it's important to know your enemy is that you'll find out that most of them aren't your enemy. They have a belief, a stupid, destructive, anti-human belief that is your enemy. But the real them doesn't want that. The real them didn't choose that. And that doesn't take away all the frustration, because they're still advocating evil stuff. But I've found, at least for me, that makes it a lot easier to go day from day surrounded by people cheering for me to be extorted and subjugated, by recognizing they weren't presented with, well, do you want to be good or evil? I want to be evil. They were sold this sales pitch, which, by the way, the Jones Plantation represents quite well, that tricked them into cheering for evil while thinking it was good. And that's why there's still hope. Because it's not a world full of genuinely evil people that you have to talk into being good, because you never would. Like, if that was the case, I'd be running off and hiding by myself in a mountain somewhere. It's a world in which there are lots and lots and lots of well-intentioned people who are accidentally advocating evil because they've been duped into it. If you can try to have sympathy and patience and recognize that they are victims of authoritarianism, even while they're being advocates of it, at least for me, that made it a lot easier to deal with. And a lot easier to talk to people and be around people knowing that their belief systems don't match mine and they advocate like statist lunacy. And recognizing I can't immediately fix them. I can try to do what I can do, but that's it. And in the meantime, recognizing this is kind of what we're stuck with, which is well-intentioned people who believe something really stupid and destructive. And try to be at peace and be thankful for the fact that at least we're not surrounded by a bunch of people who are doing this maliciously, because then you're just doomed. Then it is, run for the frickin' hills. So try to understand them, including understanding their misunderstandings of reality. Try to understand why they believe the stupid stuff they believe. And one of the things that I think helps with that the most for me is remembering the old statist me. And I still think, how the hell did I believe that stuff? That doesn't make any sense. But I can remember being well-intentioned, and I was already smart, except in that way, and I already cared about other people, and yet I fell for it. Well, think of the rest of the world as just the former you. And by the way, it would be really frustrating if you met the former you and tried to talk to them too. But that can give you a little bit of humility and give you a little bit of perspective of, okay, we're at the beginning of humanity's evolution into what humanity is supposed to be. It hasn't been there yet. It's been doing this groupthink, collectivist, authoritarian idiocy for centuries. But we're at the beginning of that. And you are lucky enough to have caught a glimpse of that truth before most of the rest of the people have. And yeah, it's frustrating, but that means you are one of the people that's going to fix the world. Because you're in that tiny group who now has to get the rest of the group to see what you see for whatever reason. You happen to read something, you happen to see something, whatever it was, you happen to get there before they did. Doesn't mean they can't get there. It doesn't mean they're not just as good as you. Right now they're advocating stupid stuff. They're the allies that you have to bring out of their shells. They're not the enemy. No matter how stupid their opinions are, no matter how zealous they are about the authoritarian crap they believe in, it's going to be a lot easier for you if you recognize that the vast majority of cheerleaders for authoritarianism are allies of yours waiting to happen. They're not actually the enemy. And living in a world where you're surrounded by the enemy, yeah, that'll tear you down and make you go insane. Living in a world where you're surrounded by potential allies who currently believe a lie, well, that can be fixed. That can actually change. And you get the privilege of being one of the people at the forefront of making that change happen. It's going to suck. It's going to be frustrating. It's going to be slow and annoying in a lot of ways. But in the long run, would you have rather understand what you understand now, or have still been one of them cheering for statist stupidity? Help them get to where you are. And if that is your focus, you'll find it a lot more comfortable and easy to deal with. If your goal is to help all those other well-intentioned people free themselves so that they're not victims of their own statism. And if that is your mindset, you'll be way better at communicating with them, and it'll be way better for you to be at peace in this pretty dang screwed up world while you're doing what you can to hopefully make it less screwed up.